the story. I'm going to pick up the story in 1783. When Dr. Kenny left off, we go to the end of the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris, which ends the war in 1783. If you're ever worried about where treaties take place, the default seems to be Paris. So 1783, the war ends, and we think of it largely in terms of creating a new nation in North America, known as the United States of America, although that'll take more than a decade before the Constitution comes into play. And it really forms a more perfect union. But it creates two nations in many ways because of British North America and the way in which it was divided. Up and until 1783, it was all British North America, including Quebec, including Nova Scotia. And Dr. Kenny talked a little bit about why those two colonies decided not to join their brethren to the south. And so we know that it has a huge impact on Canada, in large part because of what will end up being a huge refugee movement, and that is the arrival of the Loyalists, those who were either opposed to the war or who wanted to remain neutral in the war. Many of them were women. Many of them were also Indigenous peoples whose lands got caught up in the conflicts, particularly the Six Nations Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, and the ways in which the war divided them. Particularly, we're going to talk about people like Molly and Joseph Brant and John Deseronto, who will come northward after the war because they had fought alongside the British to maintain their relationships with the British Crown. And they figured that the British were going to be the best bet, much in the same way that the Indigenous peoples had seen the French as the best bet in North America prior to 1763. Many people like Brant saw the British as the best way to maintain some degree of independence. And so they came northward as quote-unquote loyalists, but obviously with their own interests first in mind, and they will settle along the north shore of Lake Ontario and down in the Grand River Valley near present-day Brantford, Ontario. And so these loyalists, I think it's really important because the loyalists in kind of Canadian history are always kind of posited as those who kind of founded Canada in opposition to the United States. That is, instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they chose God and King and country. Or, or in terms of what we'll see with the Constitution, the peace, order, and good government, right? And so they chose to remain with the Crown. Now, some of them did so for a whole range of reasons, just like Indigenous peoples. Black loyalists were often slaves who were promised their freedom in return for leaving their plantations and joining the British, and so they were promised land in Nova Scotia. But as we know, many of them did not find their new homes in Nova Scotia to be increasingly better than what they experienced south of the border, and many of them would actually leave to return to or some not so much to return to Africa, but there was a movement of many of them to a colony known as Sierra Leone. In Africa. The other thing to note here as well is that slavery does not end in the Canadas with the arrival of the black loyalists. Many blacks who come northward come as refugees, come as slaves of their loyalist masters. Right. So slavery will not end. In 1791, in the arrival of a new governor in Upper Canada known as John Graves Simcoe, he will try and end the slavery, but it will take a lot of time and really won't disappear until the 1830s when the British abolished slavery throughout their entire empire. And there's also various religious groups who come northward, many of them out of places like Pennsylvania, like Mennonites, and others and Quakers who decided that they did not want to fight in any war, and they did not want to get caught in the crossfire. And again, for things like religious liberty, they came northward to Canada because they believed that the British would honor that, right? So, okay. So the arrival of all of these thousands upon thousands of refugees that appear along the north shore of Lake Ontario into Lower Canada, but increasingly into places like Nova Scotia and also the St. John River Valley in New Brunswick, create huge issues for the British government, and they decide that they're going to then break up this huge landmass, which is either known as Nova Scotia or as Quebec, into smaller constituent colonies. And so in 1784, they decide that those who are on the banks of the St. John River will form a new colony known as New Brunswick. And again, many of these loyalists, even though they've chosen God and King and Country, they still have a kind of a rebellious American spirit about, you know, wanting to maintain their rights, wanting to maintain their rights as freeborn Englishmen, which meant assemblies and it meant freedom and all of those other kinds of things. So those who opposed the American Revolution weren't necessarily opposed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They just believed that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness might be better pursued under British forms of government. So 1784, we get the breakup of Nova Scotia into two colonies, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And then in 1791, in many ways to accommodate all of these new Anglo settlers who have arrived in Lower Canada, they pass something known as the Constitutional Act. And that will establish two new colonies. One is Upper Canada, which we know will become Ontario, and the other one, Lower Canada, which will later become Quebec. And Lower Canada will largely retain almost all of its previous governing structures from the Quebec Act. The one thing that they will get that will be different in 1791 is that they will get an elected assembly. Okay, so that will change for Lower Canada. But Upper Canada really goes to what was planned in 1763, right? Which was British forms of government, British forms of religion, British laws. So basically, 1763 comes to British North America in Upper Canada in 1791. So the Constitutional Act lays out an elected assembly, a governor and his appointed councils, an executive council and a legislative council. And I'll talk about a little bit more about those differences right now, or in a minute. But also acts to ensure the continuation of the Anglican Church through things like the clergy reserves in Upper Canada. So 1791 is meant to create, as Governor Simcoe will say when he arrives, right, as a little Britain in the wilderness. And part of that as well is also to transfer that similar kind of class structure. So some of those loyalists who come northward are those who fought on behalf of the British, and so they're given large land grants that essentially are meant to kind of establish them as kind of sort of the social betters within the colony, and then they'll rent out that land to tenants and others. Now, this won't necessarily happen throughout the colony. There's lots and lots of land, but it's certainly the idea is to create a more hierarchical structure than what existed in the 13 colonies. The British lesson out of 1776 in the American Revolution, right, was that the Americans had too much freedom, too much liberty, and that they needed both in terms of society, but also in terms of government, needed a stronger or firmer ruling hand. And so the governor, so even though we have an elected assembly, that elected assembly has very, very limited powers. And the one thing, again, another lesson that comes out of 1776 is let the colonists tax themselves. And so the legislative assembly, which is elected by the population, almost entirely white and male at this point in time. Indigenous peoples did not have the vote. Limited numbers of women would have the vote, and they would later lose it. But essentially that they would be able to control local taxes. But most governments in this period earn money through trade and through customs duties and all kinds of other things, and that would largely be controlled by the governor and the lieutenant governor. So the governor sits in Quebec City. We have a lieutenant governor who sits eventually in York, which will become Toronto. And then they have a kind of an appointed body of advisors, right, known as the Executive Council, which you could view as a kind of pre-modern form of the cabinet, and a Legislative Council, which kind of, in the more modern period, represents what we now know as the Senate, that body of sober second thought. And they are all appointed, right? So we have this very unique split between a democratically elected assembly and on top a much more firmly held hierarchical view of a governor and his appointees. And this, as we'll see, as we move towards 1837, there'll be a number of frictions between them over the powers of controlling government in this period, because the assemblies did not have a great deal of power. Okay, so that's up until the 1790s. So it's the Constitutional Act, the Loyalists, the American Revolution creates this new British North America. So it has been British North America before, but now it's much more confined to the northern, what we now know as the northern colonies. Okay. And so between 1791 and we'll get to the War of 1812, these colonies start to grow very slowly. Most of it's formed by these loyalists. We get in Upper Canada in particular a group known as the Late Loyalists. So part of this was the plan of the governor, Lieutenant Governor Lord Simcoe, to attract American settlers. And ironically, he attracted them through things like low taxes, despite the fact that the 1776 was about taxation. And these late loyalists arrive largely because they want and they view cheap land. And so they flood across the border into places in and around Niagara and southern Ontario, and they set up farms and start to build that colony, because again, all of those land grants that Simcoe has given out to his friends, they need to have settlers on them so that they can earn money. So these late loyalists start to arrive. And the difference between the late loyalists and maybe we want to call it early loyalists is that we'll see when we get to the War of 1812, the late loyalists, their political loyalties are deemed to be much more suspect because they came north largely for land, not because perhaps of ideological reasons. So in the midst of all of this, right, we're still trying to work out elements of what's going on in 1783 in the Treaty of Paris. And in the Treaty of Paris, in the ideas of the British and the Americans to kind of make up over their conflict, there were a number of things such as the compensation for loyalists and things like that, the abandonment of British forts in the interior. But both sides, very much were trying to wiggle their way out of these treaties. And this is going to affect Indigenous peoples in particular. And so in the 1790s, the Americans finally view the British as gone, and they start to flood into the interior or into the Ohio Valley and elsewhere. And they come up hard against Indigenous resistance because they view this as their land, their territory. Now the British are also worried because Upper Canada is this kind of soft underbelly of British North America, and they try and maintain some of these forts in the interior because the Americans don't want to pay for lost property of the Loyalists during the war. Eventually, they come to an agreement in 1794 with something known as Jay's Treaty, and the British decide to abandon these forts. And so Indigenous peoples, like people like Brant and others, view this in some ways as something that was that they had been kind of outdone or outsmarted by the British. They couldn't necessarily trust them. But the British had to walk this kind of fine line, and so they continue to work with Indigenous peoples throughout the Ohio Valley and in through southern Ontario to kind of maintain that buffer zone between American settlers who want to keep moving northward and obviously British-controlled territory. And so again, much like the French used the interior to keep the British out before 1763, the British will use Indigenous peoples to keep the Americans out. Also going on in this period, we also have to note here are the Napoleon. Well, first is the French Revolution, so ideas that have come out of the United States have now kind of jumped across the sea, and now we have liberty, fraternity, and oh gosh, I can't remember the other one. Anyway, but we have these ideas of liberty, and France and Britain are back at war again, and they'll be largely at war between 1791 and 1814, which really means that the development of these colonies is going to be delayed because immigrants aren't going to arrive. They're needed for armies and navies and all kinds of other things back home in Britain. But these Napoleonic Wars also create a huge issue in North America, because this new United States basically says, well, yes, we know we were once British, but you know the French helped us out to defeat the British in the Revolutionary War. We want to maintain some degree of neutrality, right? We still want to trade, and we should be able to trade with whoever we feel like in that regard. Your conflicts are really of no concern to us. Now the British, you know, don't want to see that, because they want to be able to defeat Napoleon's armies in Europe, and they try and blockade, and they try and disrupt shipping. And most of this, again, is this battle between the French and the English to gain the allies of the Americans. And it ends up between 1801 and 1812 as creating a huge conflict, particularly between the British and the Americans. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is the impressment of American sailors, many of whom had jumped ship from the Royal Navy. And second one again was this disruption of trade. The Royal Navy believed that it could stop any ship on the high seas and inspect it for cargo. It could blockade ports and do all kinds of other things like that. And again, it fell most heavily on the United States. And the last one again was this issue of indigenous support of indigenous peoples in the interior of North America. And the Americans, you know, believed that the only reason why they were losing some of these battles and wars to indigenous peoples throughout the 1790s and into the early 1800s was that the British were supplying them with weapons and trade and all kinds of other things. So those are kind of the big causes of the War of 1812. And as we know, war breaks out between 1812 and 1814. The Americans decide that, you know, they can't challenge the British on the high seas or anything else like that, but they could send a message by marching into Canada. And they do so first at Detroit, and then along the Niagara Peninsula. Eventually the war will spread throughout and along the St. Lawrence, but largely does not touch the Atlantic colonies, who actually benefit from this largely, and even in this Napoleonic era, right, by supplying things like timber, which are going to be really, really necessary for the Royal Navy over this period. So it becomes a very strategic good. And once their regular markets in Europe have been lost to the European, to Napoleon's blockade. So the maritime colonies, the Atlantic colonies, will actually benefit, right, from the War of 1812, but largely stay out of the fray. Now we know that it's led by General Brock in Upper Canada, and his ally Tecumseh, who's part of these indigenous peoples of the Ohio Valley, who really want to keep the Americans at bay. And Tecumseh goes to war against a number of U.S. armies in this period, and allies with Brock, largely because he views, again, Brock as the best hope. And same thing with Brock. Brock relies heavily on Tecumseh to kind of scare the Americans, to keep them at bay, to attack at places like Michilimackinac and Detroit, and keep the Americans at bay, right, over this period. Now, unfortunately, Tecumseh will die. The Battle of Moraviantown in 1813, and indigenous peoples will play less of a role in the war, and unfortunately, in many ways, as we'll see throughout this period, less of a role in Canada, because their strength as a military, diplomatic, and trading ally was starting to decline over this period. And really, you can kind of date it to what happens in the War of 1812 and the loss of those kind of indigenous allies. Now, in 1814, at the Treaty of Ghent, we know that the two sides come out and they largely decide to go back to the status quo before the war even broke out. Okay, so that's kind of the nutshell, the War of 1812. And it does have a tremendous impact on the politics of Upper Canada, because again, it pits these kind of more sort of maybe what we might call liberal, or people who have more sort of American ideas about how politics should work, against those who believe, these kind of more late loyalist people like the John Strawns of the colony, who believe again in peace, order, and good government. And there's a whole range of issues about loyalty that arise in the aftermath of the War of 1812. The other thing we should note here as well is that in the midst of all of this war, there's another conflict going on in the West, and that is happens when Lord Selkirk decides to settle a group of Scottish crofters, and that at Red River, present-day Winnipeg, in 1811 and 1812. And certainly the indigenous peoples of the West, particularly this growing community of Métis peoples, who are largely people who have been involved in the fur trade for a very long time, working with companies such as the Northwest Company, but also the Hudson's Bay Company, the alliances that have been formed in those trades between largely Cree, Ojibwe, Anishinaabes peoples, and European traders. But they come to see them, increasingly come to see themselves as a distinct people, not only distinct from Europeans, but also distinct from other indigenous peoples around them. And they view this territory in southern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario as kind of their territory. Now, throughout all of this, we know that we get a conflict between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company over the control of this territory, the control of people who are involved in the trade. But it's really set off by Lord Selkirk's idea of settling in Red River. And we get a decade's worth of conflict between the two companies, but also involving indigenous peoples, including the Métis peoples, who, as we know, in 1817 decide to strike back and strike a sense of independence at something known as the Battle of Seven Oaks. Now, eventually that fur trade will be consolidated in 1820 with the merger of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. But really the fur trade is starting to decline over this period. It is its importance. So if we're looking at, kind of the economic issues that are growing, or economic growth that's growing in this period, right, we're going to focus mostly on agriculture, because that's why people are coming to settle Upper Canada, Lower Canada, but also the Atlantic colonies. The growth of this timber trade, which becomes very, very strategic in light of the needs of things like the Royal Navy, but I mean, timber is used for everything. It's used for fuel, it's used to build houses, it's used for just about everything. This will create shipping and shipbuilding industries in Atlantic Canada, but also in places like Quebec. And this is often known as the kind of golden age of sail, and the Atlantic colonies do very, very well in this period as commerce and shipping and timber really start to take off. So this is a decline then of the